the first question when we talk about what do we mean when we want Volta to be production quality, we have to define what we really want. And one of the key values here is it's usable. It does something useful, right? We have this tendency to always develop new features. Sometimes we need them, sometimes we don't. But we have to figure out what we really need and make that work, and work predictably over and over again. We need to make sure that when we're out in the field, it's supportable. If something goes wrong, the operators, who aren't software engineers typically, have to know how to go and fix it or get it back working, right? These are things that when you're building production-grade software, the carriers, the operators, they expect it. And the problem is they're not getting it from Volta today. And then you have to understand is, do we need a production version of Volta? Is Volta really just a scientific experiment that allows us to play with new concepts, or do we expect this to work? And so some quotes I just pulled off the internet here. You know, we do need it. Operators are asking for it. So we're not doing this because we want to do it. We're doing it because we have to do it. If we expect the carriers to be able to deploy these capabilities and distract the edge, something like this is necessary. And so that's why we're doing this. So my little video here. The problem with Volta, and still with Volta today, is that effectively we're trying to repair the train as it's moving. And anybody who's ever tried to do that will quickly realize that you cannot do that. Right? You know, to be fair, in the video we actually does it, but that's neither here nor there. So what we've experienced in Volta and what led to the Stabilization Brigade is this constant introduction of new features, weren't fully tested. They kind of worked, and we're always going to the next demo. And the next demo looked great. It brought people in, made people interested, but it never got to the point where we could actually deploy this outside a demo. And if your goal is only to do demos, that's great, right? You know, from an ONF perspective, people see demos, people come to ONF events, people pay ONF fees. That's a great business model. No, not really trying to knock ONF there. That's their business model, right? But the business model for operators is we got to put this in production so we get subscribers so they pay us money. And the business model for me as a Ciena employee, as a vendor, is to sell services and hardware to the operators so they'll pay me to make money. So if we can't get a quality piece of software out the door that actually works for the operators, in long term what's going to happen is the operators are going to walk away. And if the operators are going to walk away, vendors like me will walk away. And then what we have is ONF. But no one cares. So back to, if we want this to work, we have to take these ideas that have been birthed in ONF and get them to be quality-built software that can be deployed at the carriers, operators. I use carriers and operators interchangeably. I don't know if you guys care. Google mine, okay. So part of what led to where we got was that we had some poor development processes. It became a giant hackathon. And so we kind of hacked code and hoped that we'd hit the target. And unfortunately, like this, someone who built this, we didn't have a target that moved for us to always get the bullseye. So we weren't testing and how we expected to deploy in production. So we had stated publicly and had a goal of deploying in Kubernetes a multi-node cluster with HA, with being able to pull out pods, failures, and we never tested that. So we had no idea if it worked. Well, if that's our target deployment and we haven't tested it, we're in trouble. We had no unit tests. Even today, we have less than 20% code coverage on our unit tests. And you know, that's always, any metric you look like that, you can skew it so the metric looks good and it's still useless. Well, we want to skew it so the metric looks good, but they're useful unit tests. But just as a general rule of thumb, 20% coverage on your unit tests is poor. So we weren't really testing our stuff. We had regression bugs. We had all these bad behaviors because we were so focused on getting features out. And to be fair, we were at an inflection point between 1.x and 2.0 where we were doing some major re-architecture. And so there's some reasons for this. We're just trying to get feature parity. But we dropped some practices that were going to bite us later on. In fact, they did bite us. So we essentially had a choice, right? How do we go forward? What I proposed in Berlin, and I'm still kind of proposing today, is we need to stop the train or at least slow it. And what I mean by that is if you are looking to build a stable product, you have to stop introducing new features. You cannot stabilize the foundation, the base of the product, while your main focus is injecting new code into it. It's, okay, I won't say impossible. Nothing's impossible. It's very, very hard. And we haven't been successful at it in the past. So the proposal was, let's go down the sunny path. Let's go down the rock-solid path and make a great product as opposed to go down the scary path. This is what was proposed, and this is what we tried to accomplish when we pushed out the Stabilization Brigade. We did not accomplish that, in my opinion, to date, as best as we could. We still have operators and others looking to inject new code while we try to stabilize. And that's a problem that we have to deal with in the Stabilization Brigade going forward. We have to understand how to do that. Right now, well, we'll get to a little bit in later. I'll push on that one. So again, I wanted to take the majority, or I was proposing to take the majority of resources working on Volta and saying, let's shift them over to a production LTS state, like Bjorn was just talking about. Let's focus and emphasize how we build better quality software, so the processes, as well as improve the code we have, so testing and bug fix. Let's shift our focus to that. And it's boring. I understand it's not exciting. But if we shift our focus to that, we can get a rock-solid base, and then on that, we can build some really cool new features. But again, it takes the discipline to sit back and say, we're going to resist those new features and focus on what we need to get done. Eat our vegetables before we eat our cookies, is a way to put it. When we originally proposed branching and having an LTS branch and a canary branch, the idea was to say, look, we're going to eat the vegetables on the LTS side, and the canaries, those people are going to go eat their ice cream and go get diabetes. But they were still going to be able to go and work on those new feature sets. That was the plan. And that when we do the LTS, we would be restrictive. We'd have longer-term releases. I think in Bjorn's slide, he said 6 months to a year, so a longer release cycle where the canary branch could release very often with those new features. But again, it was never guaranteed to actually work more than, I don't know, or even install. The other tenet I felt if we were actually going to get to production quality software was we have to simplify. We have to specify a small subset of what we want to accomplish and go accomplish that. We often had arguments in the community meetings around Volta to say what features are MVP. And all the time, someone would come and say, I need this feature, I need this feature. And it became an ever-evolving list. If any feature got implemented, someone else would come up with a new feature that needed to get added. We could never actually pin down what we wanted to accomplish to a very small subset and then attack it. It was just requests were coming too quickly. Case in point, once we came out with kind of this format, people were going, well, what about multicast? What about multi-tcomp? And you had to like go, whoa, guys, if we're really going to stabilize, we got to resist it. If we just say, let's say we put multicast on this and multi-tcomp, someone's going to come up with something next. Are we going to stop there? It just becomes a slippery slope that you never actually say no to any new features. And so we tried to say, look, this is what we're going to call it at. And when this original slide was built, you can see, well, maybe you can see, the technical profile and event format normalization was actually in red. It was questionable whether we were going to do it. Turned out we did bring it in. And that's what we tried to focus on. But as a case in point example, we just had some great work done by Scott to add increased logging capabilities to it, right? And from a stabilization point of view, it's a new feature, right? It's a great new feature. It's a useful new feature, but it's a new feature. So the question comes up, do we add it under the Stabilization Brigade? Ultimately, we said yes, but again, we kind of broke the rule. We added a new feature set. Now, one of the things that happened when we created the Stabilization Brigade, when I presented this, I called production quality. We created a Stabilization Brigade, and that's a little verbal gymnastics, if you will, but there's differences. When I say I'm trying to build something for product, that has a lot of connotations with it. That says stuff like the Scott built for logging, absolutely in, because we need it to make something production from that sustainability or supportability point of view. Where if I say sustainability, you could say, well, it's a new feature. It causes new bugs in the system potentially that we have to debug, so it destabilizes the production. So there is a little bit of that game that we have to play and figure out where that balance is. But ultimately, we have to be very careful about huge new features. Again, multiple TCON, multicast, those type of things. And we're continuing to get those pressures. And we've already seen those pressures today as I'm going to use the Tiger team concept that people have come up with, that they want to say, oh, we need, or carriers need, operators need these new feature sets in order to go to production. And that's great, I understand that, they may. But if we introduce those new features now, we take our forks and we make that gap between the canary, if you will, and the LTS or the stabilization fork, we make that gap bigger and bigger and bigger. And where that becomes a problem, we've seen it today where the gap isn't as big, is we're forced to do double edits between them, what we call cherry pick and get turns. And we're already seeing management problems around that. And the more we diverge these two branches, the more difficult that task gets. So intuitively, I want to ask the operators, and they will probably say no, is stop, right? If you have resources you want to contribute to Volta, by all means, we want those. We absolutely want those. Can we have them work on the stabilization? Can we have the discipline to resist those new features for a short time, get stable, and then introduce those new features? If we have the resources, we have enough problems to fix, and we need people to fix them. But if we really want to get stable, can we resist that? To date, I think the answer has been no. Maybe not directly, but at least through what I've seen in behaviors. Again, not trying to blame the operators for this. I understand they have business needs. But if they're not going to resist those new features, as the stabilization brigade goes forward, we're going to have to recognize that reality. And that may mean the branching mechanism that we're doing today and trying to do double edits isn't going to work. And so one of the questions we have to ask as we go forward in the stabilization brigade is, do we change our strategy around that? So this just kind of goes over some of the, verbally, what we had originally planned in terms of migration. The idea was have these two branches, bug fix in the stabilization branch, and then carry those bug fixes over back to the master branch or the canary branch. And we had visions of, hey, we can do support branches or feature branches and then merge those into canary. And it's this lovely chart here that is actually very complicated to implement. But the idea was that we didn't want to stop the canaries, but we wanted to have stabilization. And originally, if you look at it, what happened is the stabilization was going to be master, and the canaries were going to be essentially branches off master, and then you'd merge those canaries back in. As we formed the stabilization brigade, that didn't happen at all. Happened essentially exactly the opposite, where the stabilization became essentially a release branch for Volta, and the canary was going to continue on the master. And as I indicated, that has already caused us problems. One of the questions was, are we doing this already, right? Are we trying to provide Volta stabilization? And at the time I gave this presentation in Berlin, the answer was absolutely no, we're not. We're doing feature implementation. Today, there has been a formalization of the Stabilization Brigade. I want to thank everybody who's actually contributed there. It's actually been from my perspective at least, it's been a huge success for this little bit, right? The operators have chipped in resources either directly or through their partners. Deutsche Telekom has pulled in reply, and Radis has been great help. AT&T has been a real big supporter. So we've got a lot of support from the operators in there. And so that's been a huge thing. We saw a real focus on quality. We've seen a focus on testing Volta from end to end, at least in simulation, as well as a desire to put it in hardware. EdgeCore has also been another big help here. We've seen an emphasis on really running the system, doing deep debug into figuring what's going on. There's some complex interaction between components. And so people have essentially been doing low-level kernel programming, if you will. Not quite that low level, but that deep of stuff, watching packets go back and forth, messages go back and forth. So there's been that emphasis, re-emphasis around Volta on trying to get it to a quality and repeatable capability so that we could run a simulation test over and over and over, and it works. ONF has been working to automate some of these tests, which is great. These are all great things. So we've started doing that. And to be fair, ONF has always tried to automate these tests. It's just they've been book solid, right? They've been overwhelmed with what's available. And so having resources coming from carriers and their partners to help out is huge. And that really has to happen, continue to happen, if we're going to make this a production quality system. We're still at an influx between 1.x and 2.0, or 2.x, if you will, in Volta. For those that aren't familiar, 1.x essentially was the initial implementation with many components written in Python. 2.x is a re-implementation of some of those components, most of those components, in the Go programming language. There was justifications for doing that, mostly around how Python deals with multiple threading concurrency. Beyond that, we were also doing some re-architecture around Volta in terms of what they call the single core to multi-core, to cover some use cases around HA as well as scalability. So that inflection point's still going on. We still have people working on 1.x and committing code to like the 1.x tree, which means that's divergent from the 2.x tree. These are all issues and pain points around stability, and someone's got to take the effort to keep those in sync, and that's just, again, a pain point. If we as a community want a stable product around 2.x, we as a community have to figure out how to do that. And just to correct a point that was made earlier, I think in one of the keynotes, they talked about a release of CIBA, using the new release of CIBA using 1.7 or something. That's a correction. It actually is based on 2.x. So I want to make that clear that as CIBA goes forward, they're going to be using 2.x. Just more push for people to get on the 2.x scenario. The other question when people look at, hey, if we want stabilization, can't we just, do more testing? Yeah, absolutely. We have to if we want to make it stable, but we don't have a good track record is what it comes down to. We have a lot of people that love to develop stuff, right? You hire an engineer wants to invent things. That's what we do. So given the choice of inventing things versus doing the boring work, they're going to choose inventing. They're going to try the new things. They're going to experiment with Golang because, well, Golang's fun. It's a new thing I can learn. They're going to experience Kafka. Well, that's a new thing. I'm going to learn it, right? They're going to go for these new things. That's what engineers do. We need to change the mindset, though, and say we need some of your help doing the boring stuff. We need some of your help doing the test stuff. And if we had, again, the discipline to do some of this, that would be great. Track record hasn't shown that. But again, the Stabilization Brigade's helped because it has put some re-emphasis on that, and people are kind of acknowledging that it needs to be done if we're to get production, and therefore dedicating resources to it. So there is some work there. The other thing I wanted to make clear here is when we created the brigade, the point of the brigade wasn't to, hey, we're going to stabilize Volta and then we're done, and never have to worry about stabilization again. That's not how this works, right? The real point of the Stabilization Brigade, beyond let's fix some bugs that need to be fixed, was we have to create, if you will, or define or document processes, requirements for code going forward. This includes things like you cannot merge your patch set until such and such test is patched, till there's this much coverage on it, right? We're going to put more rigor into the process around software development for at least Volta, to make sure that after this brigade closes, and I'd be happy to close anytime it can, but after this brigade closes, that going forward we don't run into this problem again. And that's a key. I don't want to come 6 months down the road and say, oh great, we're unstable again. Because, well, it's been fun, I don't want to have to do it again. It's just not that fun. So we have to focus on this, and it becomes part of our behavior, part of our ingrained processes within the Volta community. And if you haven't developed software for a production quality system, you're going to hate it. You really are going to hate it. It's more process. But if you want your stuff to get used in production, trust me, it's really quite fun when you get a customer call and they say you're using your software to support customers. You got to do this. The other question is, and this has been a quote from people at ONF, oh, we build the software, vendors are supposed to harden it. Yeah, that could happen. The problem there is vendors tend to create vendor forks. And they patch that fork and they sell that fork because it has fixes that the general one doesn't have, and because they have control of that fork. Right? They can commit anything they want to it, including things that may not belong in the general source. So yeah, we could have a vendor do this and then Ciena would have its fork, and it'd be able to sell you that, and Radisys might have, sorry, I'm just going to use you because you're here. Radisys might have their own fork, and they could sell that. NetCia could have their own fork, and they can sell that. And now we have 3 different versions of Volta. And they're all on their different paths. And one of the things that it was stated earlier that operators go for open source is to prevent vendor lock-in. The minute you have vendors do this, and they create proprietary branches, you've got vendor lock-in. Congratulations, you've failed, right? Or we failed. Right? So you can't have a vendor do this. This has to be done in open source if we don't want to get back to the vendor lock-in. Now, again, I'm a vendor. Vendor lock-in's not a bad thing as long as it's me. But, you know, we don't want that. So in practice, this is what happened. We created the Volta 2.0, essentially release branch. We call it stabilization branch, but let's not kid ourselves. It's a release branch. And we put bug fixes in. And the idea was the process that everybody was meant to follow was put your bug fixes in the Volta 2.1 branch and then cherry pick those to master branch. And in master branch, new features would be added just as they've always been. In practice, what happens is people are putting bug fixes in master branch. Sometimes they're cherry picking them, sometimes they're not. I end up going through and trying to figure out what's been cherry picked and should it be cherry picked, and then a build fails, and then we have to go back and oh, because we've got the patch that's out of order now, you can't just do a clean cherry pick, you're actually doing a manual merge, and no one sleeps. So we've actually created instability, which isn't really what we planned to do. And so one of the things as a brigade we have to deal with is we have to solve this issue. And if that issue is to destroy the Volta 2.1 branch, recognize new features are going to be in, and work on a single branch, that may be the way. That's something that is going to be upcoming discussions within the community. This slide Bjorn showed as well, or at least a variation of this slide. This is coming out of DT through its partners, EdgeCore Reply. I've been working with them a little bit as well. This really characterizes what we talked about before with the stabilization branch as well as patch sets in the master. What it also clarifies is that DT has other additional feature sets that they're going to try to add on top of stabilization. And again, we've talked about this. How's that work? Still problematic. But one thing important it does highlight is they have specific timeline goals. And when we work with carriers, even in the open source, we have to respect those goals. We know that carriers, operators have to get to production quality. Their bonuses might depend on them getting something to production so they can show their manager. So those are real requirements, right? Those are real important things, right? And people who are deploying this in the field, their bonuses really matter is if it stays up and running. If their customers start complaining, their bonuses go down. So we have to actually balance that with stabilization or production quality as well. So as under this brigade, we have created a couple focus groups. One was kind of, we go through the GIF and JIRAs within the community and say, okay, what really is part of the stabilization effort? We want to make sure that we're focusing on those JIRAs and trying to get the stabilization community focused on the JIRAs that will bring a more stable solution. That's kind of what the first one does. Automated test framework, I think is a very valuable one in terms of how do we take the tests that we want to run, that we want to use to verify the system, continually verify the system, and ensure they're running, ensure they're automated, running in simulation mode, running in hardware mode, and that these work consistently. And when they fail, we scream and shout, and the whole community stops and says, fix the build before we move on. So that's a very important work done, and until we really have that automated test framework and get our code coverage up, the other things are nice, but we need that, right? Then finally, code commit standards. I'll be the first to admit, I get these requests all the time. Can you please just +1 this so I can merge it? I'm doing something else. Okay, yeah, sure, +1, right? If you haven't done that, you're not part of the community, right? Everybody has the bad behaviors, self-included. We have to be better about that. We have to improve about that. The developers within the community have to start saying, you know, 50% of my time may be reviewing code and going through it fine grain and doing a really good job of reviews, not just reviewing it because Ken's my buddy and I like him, and right? It happens, right? It just happens. I get it. But we need to stop it. In terms of other code commit standards, work that Zach's been doing in terms of linting and more static analysis tests, those are good things too, and we have to start paying attention to those and just improve our quality and just put focus on it. It's the end of the story, right? That's what we have to do.
Dave, I got a question for you.
Yes.
Before you go So along these lines,
The previous slide?
yeah, well, yeah, not directly, but one of the things
the wrong
we've
way.
run into is there's code that is submitted that the only way to test it is to have actual OLT hardware and ONT hardware. And that's the stuff that eats Matt's lunch, right?
Yep.
Because there's very few facilities in this community that actually have hardware. And we don't have to solve that now, but I think maybe we need to rationalize who works on what based on their ability to actually unit test their own work. So I'm just going to throw that out to the community because there's way too many things. Matt has to do the full build, do the full run, and say, nah, it doesn't work.
Yep.
And,
No.
and
I absolutely agree. We need more hardware testing, and I know the issue. Yeah, I won't repeat it. I'll summarize it. How's that?
Okay.
We don't have enough hardware. Not everybody's testing with hardware.
Well,
And
but also, I think, who submits code? I mean, if you're submitting code that to prove it works needs to run on hardware, you're probably working on the wrong thing. I mean, just to be blunt about it, you're not doing big favors to anybody that actually has hardware, right? I mean, we would rather have Matt working on stabilization, not QAing other people's code. I mean,
I
just
kind of like him QAing other
yeah,
people.
well, but I'm his lead, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
I get
I'm the
that,
one that's got
absolutely.
to keep buying him beers so he doesn't run away.
Well, I can help contribute to the beer fund, but yes.
But my point is serious,
No,
right?
your
I
point
mean,
is absolutely right.
I mean, if you can't test your code, you don't even know. And I'm not, disparaging anybody. Everybody's trying to commit and be part of the community. But if you can't unit test your code, the chances we're going to catch it in a regression test or everything else goes down.
Yep.
And you can't inspect quality into something.
I agree, and there's been work, and ONF is trying to get their hardware lab up and running so that they can do some of these more automated tests as well. And I think if we can give access to those so people can run those tests as they're building on real hardware, there's value in that. As well as, we found some bugs by running in software because all of a sudden latencies changed when you went to simulation. And we found other bugs in the core because they weren't ready for those real quick latencies. And we found a couple people putting sleeps in your code. So here's my little pitch. If you put sleep in your code, I'm going to hunt you down. Sleep is not a bug fix. All right. Status, the good. We've got 2 minutes left, right? 2 minutes left. The good, we got the brigade created where there's a new focus on stabilization, good stuff. The bad, bug fixes, we're checking those in. We're still not contributing unit tests, so our code coverage sucks. New feature development, we need people to stop and focus on the stabilization. The ugly, cherry picking isn't working. People aren't doing it. If you commit on one branch, please cherry pick on the other. I beg you. Takeaways. If we don't change behavior, good old Einstein's definition, if you don't change something, nothing's going to change, right? So if we want change, you got to change. Everything is permissible. Not everything is beneficial. Yes, you can still commit new code. It's possible. Not going to necessarily help get to a stabilization effort. If we want to get to production, we better darn well stabilize this stuff, or the operators walk away, the vendors walk away, and all that's left is ONF running through the trees. And then again, simplification, always a good thing. Thank you.